The autumn rain fell like tears upon the windows of Ashford House, each droplet a small funeral for what once had been. Inside the drawing room, where creditors had stripped the walls bare of ancestral portraits, Lady Eleanor Ashford stood with her hands folded before her, a portrait herself of dignified devastation. At 24 she had imagined a different life, one filled with love, perhaps, or at least choice. Instead, she faced the Earl of Blackwood across her father's empty desk, the mahogany surface scarred with the rings of countless whiskey glasses her father had emptied in his final, desperate months. The Earl was tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter storms, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. He had not removed his gloves since entering her home, as though he feared contamination from their misfortune, or perhaps from something else entirely. "I require a wife," he said, his voice as cold and formal as a legal document. "You require salvation from social ruin and debtor's prison. The arrangement would be simple, Lady Eleanor. You would bear my name, manage my household, and enjoy financial security. In return, I ask only for your discretion and your presence at necessary social functions." Eleanor's throat tightened, but she maintained her composure. "And what of the other aspects of marriage, my lord?" The Earl's jaw hardened, a muscle twitching beneath his pale skin. "I will never touch you," he declared, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You will have your own quarters, your own life. I require an heir eventually, but that can be arranged through other means, or perhaps not at all. My line dies with me, I care not." The cruelty of it took her breath, yet Eleanor understood that cruelty born of pain often masqueraded as indifference. She had heard the whispers about his first wife, dead these 3 years past, and the Earl who had locked himself away in his grief. "I accept," she whispered, sealing her fate with 2 small words. The rain continued its morning song against the windows, and neither noticed that both their hands trembled, his hidden in his gloves, hers concealed in the folds of her worn black mourning dress. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin. The church bells of St. Michael's tolled with all the joy of a funeral dirge. Eleanor stood before the altar, in a gown of ivory silk borrowed, like so much else in her life now, from the Earl's vast stores, likely worn by his first wife. The thought made her skin prickle, but she kept her spine straight, her chin lifted, her eyes forward. Adrian Thorne stood beside her like a marble statue, his face carved from stone, his responses to the vicar's questions delivered in a voice devoid of inflection. When the moment came to take her hand, he did so with his gloves still on, and Eleanor felt the leather barrier between their skin like a wall between 2 countries at war. The guests, and there were many, for an earl's wedding demanded attendance regardless of affection, filled the pews with rustling silks and barely concealed gossip. "Poor creature," one matron whispered behind her fan, "a business arrangement, nothing more." "They say he keeps his first wife's rooms locked," another added. "Shrine to the dead, curse upon the living." Eleanor heard it all, felt the weight of their pity and their fascination, but she did not falter. What Adrian Thorne could not know, standing rigid beside her, was that his coldness did not wound her as deeply as he perhaps intended. She had learned in her father's final days that people built walls around their pain, and the higher the wall, the greater the hurt it protected. As the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Adrian did not kiss her, merely inclined his head with the barest fraction of acknowledgement. Yet in that moment, Eleanor glimpsed something in his storm-grey eyes that was not indifference at all, but terror. He was not a man who felt nothing. He was a man who felt too much, and feared the feeling would destroy him. The realization settled in her chest like a stone in deep water. They traveled to Blackwood Manor in separate carriages. When they arrived, the housekeeper, Mrs. Phillips, led Eleanor through endless corridors to the east wing, isolated, distant, a kingdom unto itself. "His lordship's quarters are in the west wing, my lady," Mrs. Phillips explained, her tone carefully neutral. "He thought you might prefer the morning light." Eleanor stood at her window, watching the sun set over unfamiliar gardens, and understood perfectly. She had married a ghost of a man, and he had given her a beautiful prison in which to haunt. Weeks passed like ships in fog, visible only in outline, drifting without collision. Eleanor learned the rhythms of Blackwood Manor, the way one learns a foreign language, through careful observation and patient repetition. The house itself was magnificent in its sorrow, all dark wood and velvet curtains, portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames, and rooms that echoed with the memory of laughter long since silenced. She breakfasted alone in the morning room, where light streamed through tall windows, dined alone in her quarters at night, and in between, she wandered. The library held thousands of volumes, their leather spines cracked with age and use. The music room contained a pianoforte covered in dust. The conservatory's glass walls revealed gardens gone wild with neglect, beauty tangled with decay. And everywhere, the absence of the Earl, or rather, his presence as absence, the shape of him moving through the house like a shadow she could never quite catch. She saw him, of course. From her window, she watched him take his solitary walks each morning, striding through the grounds with his hands clasped behind his back, his dark coat billowing in the wind like the wings of some wounded bird. She glimpsed him in the study late at night, lamplight illuminating his profile as he bent over ledgers and correspondence, working as though labor might exhaust the demons that plagued him. They spoke perhaps a dozen words a week. Good morning, delivered in passing. The weather has turned. Observed to fill silence at a chance corridor meeting. Thank you, whispered by Eleanor when he arranged for her mother's modest pension without being asked. But mostly, silence. Eleanor found the rose garden by accident, hidden behind a stone wall at the manor's southern edge. It had been beautiful once she could see that in the bones of it, in the carefully planned beds and the wrought iron arbors now choked with thorns. Someone had loved this place. Someone had tended it with devotion. She began, tentatively at first, to clear away the dead growth, to prune the wild canes, to coax life back into the neglected earth. She did not know that Adrian watched from his study window, his hand frozen on the curtain, his breath caught in his throat. She did not know that the rose garden had been his wife's sanctuary, or that seeing Eleanor there, alive, patient, creating beauty from ruin made his chest ache with something he dared not name. The library became Eleanor's refuge, a cathedral of words where silence felt purposeful rather than empty. She had discovered it properly on a rain-drenched afternoon in her third week at Blackwood Manor, and since then she returned daily, drawn by the smell of leather and old paper, by the promise of worlds beyond her gilded cage. She had been careful to avoid what she assumed were Adrian's favorites, the philosophy and agricultural treatises on the lower shelves, the political volumes near his preferred reading chair. Instead, she gravitated toward the poetry, slim volumes tucked into corners like forgotten prayers. She was reading Wordsworth, curled into the window seat with autumn light falling across the pages, when she heard his footsteps. Her heart lurched, but she did not move, did not acknowledge his presence. Perhaps he would simply take what he needed and leave, as he always did. That was her favorite. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book. She looked up to find Adrian standing in the doorway, still as a portrait, his face unreadable. I did not know, my lord. I can return it to no. He moved into the room with the careful control of a man walking on ice. You may read what you wish. The library is yours as much as mine. The politeness was excruciating, formal as a minuet. Eleanor closed the book, her thumb marking the page. She had excellent taste, she offered quietly, unsure whether to apologize or pretend ignorance. Something flickered across Adrian's face, pain, raw and unguarded, gone as quickly as it appeared. She had taste in many things, he said, his voice rough now, stripped of its usual cold precision. Poetry, roses, broken men she thought she could heal. He turned away sharply, his hand gripping the back of a chair. I loved her, he said to the empty fireplace, the words torn from somewhere deep. And my love killed her. Childbirth. The physicians said her constitution was too delicate, that she should never have. He stopped himself, his shoulders rigid. Forgive me. This is inappropriate. Eleanor stood slowly, the book clutched to her chest. My lord, Adrian, he interrupted, still not looking at her. If we must live as strangers, at least let us dispense with unnecessary formality in private. Then he left, his footsteps echoing through the corridors, leaving Eleanor standing in the fading light, with her heart breaking for a man who had loved too well and feared he might love again. Eleanor began with roses from the garden. She had reclaimed small bouquets placed in the morning room, where weak sunlight pooled on mahogany tables, in the entrance hall, where their fragrance might greet him upon returning from his solitary walks. She said nothing about them, made no claim to the gesture, but each morning she replaced the wilting stems with fresh blooms, pink and white and deep crimson, petals soft as secrets. She watched, too, in the quiet way women have always watched the men they live among. She noticed that Adrian took his tea without sugar but with a precise measure of milk, that he preferred the darker Assam blend in the mornings and the lighter Ceylon in the afternoons. She mentioned it to Mrs. Phillips, casually, as though the observation meant nothing at all, and thereafter his preferred teas appeared in the study and drawing room without fanfare, without explanation. Adrian noticed. How could he not? The flowers appeared like gentle ghosts of better days, their scent triggering memories he had locked away. The tea arrived perfectly prepared, and he found himself wondering whether Eleanor had instructed the staff or whether she had somehow intuited his preferences through pure attention. He said nothing, of course. To acknowledge the gestures would be to acknowledge her, and acknowledgement led to attachment, and attachment led to loss. Yet he found himself seeking out the rooms where her flowers bloomed, breathing in their fragrance like a man starved for air. One evening in late October, music drifted through the manor's corridors, tentative at first, then growing stronger, more confident. Eleanor had discovered the pianoforte, had pushed back the dust cover, and was playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, her fingers finding the melancholy notes as though they had been waiting all this time to be released. Adrian froze in the hallway outside the music room, his hand pressed against the wall for support. Catherine had played. Catherine had filled these rooms with music, had made the manor feel alive. He had locked the instrument away after her death, unable to bear the silence of the keys, and now this woman, his wife, who was not his wife, had unlocked it again. He should walk away. He should maintain the distance he had so carefully constructed. Instead, he stood in the shadows and listened, his eyes closed, his chest tight with an emotion he could not name. The music was different from Catherine's, playing less technically perfect perhaps, but achingly sincere, full of a longing that matched his own. When Eleanor finished, the silence that followed felt different than before, not empty, but full, pregnant with possibility. Adrian retreated to his study before she could discover him, but something had shifted. Some wall had developed the first hairline fracture. Eleanor had ventured beyond the manor's manicured grounds on a grey November morning, walking the lanes that connected the tenant farms to the estate proper. What she found troubled her deeply: cottages with roofs that leaked, children thin-faced and coughing, fields lying fallow because the families lacked seed for planting. She had managed her father's declining estate in his final years, had learned the delicate mathematics of land and labor, and she recognized neglect when she saw it. That evening, she did not wait for Adrian to retreat to his study. She intercepted him in the hallway outside the dining room, her spine straight, her resolve fortified by the memory of a young mother's hollow eyes. "My lord, I must speak with you about the tenant families." Adrian's expression shuttered immediately. "Mrs. Phillips handles household matters. The steward manages—" "The steward has neglected his duties," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The Dawson cottage has a roof that will not survive winter. The Mitchells have 3 children suffering from lung fever because of the damp. The western fields lie unplanted because your tenants cannot afford seed." His jaw tightened. "Lady Eleanor, you overstep. Estate management is not a woman's concern?" Her eyes flashed. "I managed Ashford's estates for 2 years before my father's death. I know land yields and crop rotations, tenant rights and fair rents. Your people are suffering, and whether you wish to acknowledge my existence or not, I am the Countess of Blackwood, and their welfare is my responsibility as much as yours." Adrian stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. This woman who had moved through his house like a whisper, now standing before him with the force of a storm. "You managed Ashford?" "Everything except the debts my father hid from me," she replied quietly. "I learned estate accounts at 15, my lord. I learned compassion far earlier." The silence stretched between them, taut as a violin string. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice grudging. "What do you propose?" Eleanor pulled a folded paper from her pocket. She had come prepared. Roof repairs before the heavy snows, medical attention for the sick children, seed loans to be repaid after harvest. The cost would be minimal compared to losing productive families to disease or departure. He took the paper, his gloved fingers brushing hers briefly. He read it carefully, and something in his expression shifted respect, perhaps, or surprise, or the first crack in the armor he wore like a second skin. "Very well," he said finally. "Instruct the steward, and Lady Eleanor." He paused, his grey eyes meeting hers. "You did not overstep." The estate work became a bridge between their separate lives, narrow but traversable. Adrian began appearing at Eleanor's morning room with questions about tenant concerns, ledgers tucked under his arm, his manner still formal but no longer quite so cold. She would pour tea the Assam he preferred, and they would discuss grain prices and drainage problems, their conversations practical, purposeful, safe. Yet gradually, inevitably, the boundaries softened. Adrian began seeking her opinion not just on tenant matters, but on broader estate decisions, whether to invest in new breeding stock, how to handle a dispute between neighboring families. Eleanor discovered that beneath his glacial exterior lived a mind both sharp and fair, a man who carried the weight of responsibility like a crown of thorns. Dinners, which had been solitary affairs, became shared occasions. Not every night, and never acknowledged as deliberate, but increasingly frequent. They sat at opposite ends of the long table at first, the distance between them vast enough to echo, but conversation, tentative, careful, began to fill the space. One evening, when Eleanor asked about the portraits in the gallery, Adrian spoke of his childhood, of a father whose expectations were impossible, and a mother who died too young. "I was groomed for duty," he said, his voice quiet, his fingers tracing the stem of his wineglass. Love was never part of the curriculum. Eleanor understood then the architecture of his loneliness. "My father loved me," she offered in return, "but he loved his vices more. I watched him destroy everything we had, and I could not stop him. I learned that love alone is not always enough to save someone." Adrian's eyes met hers across the candlelight, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, that they were both survivors of different shipwrecks, clinging to different pieces of wreckage. The respect that grew between them was quiet but undeniable, built on competence and shared purpose, on late-night discussions about crop rotation that somehow became conversations about poetry, about loss, about the peculiar burden of inheriting broken things and trying to make them whole. Yet always, the distance remained. Adrian never removed his gloves in her presence. They never touched except in passing, and even then, accidentally. But Eleanor found herself watching for him, listening for his footsteps, and knew with a certainty that terrified her. She was beginning to love the man her husband was becoming, even as he held himself carefully beyond her reach. The assembly at Thornfield Hall glittered with false warmth, all candlelight and forced gaiety. The county's finest families gathered to assess the Earl of Blackwood's mysterious marriage. Eleanor wore silk the color of midnight, a gown Adrian had insisted upon purchasing despite her protests, and she moved through the crowded rooms with the grace of a woman who had learned to wear dignity like armor. Adrian watched her from across the ballroom, champagne untouched in his hand, and felt something dangerous unfurl in his chest when Lord Hartley bent too close to Eleanor's ear, when young Pemberton's eyes lingered too long on the curve of her neck. She was beautiful. When had he allowed himself to notice? When had the observation become this sharp-edged possessiveness? "Such an unusual arrangement," Lady Ashworth's voice cut through his thoughts, the matron's fan fluttering like a predatory bird. "A marriage of convenience, they say. One wonders if the Earl will ever produce an heir, or if he's content to let his line die with his peculiarities." Eleanor, standing nearby with a group of women, heard every word intended, of course, as cruelty always was. Adrian saw her fingers tighten briefly on her glass, saw the moment of pain flash across her face before she schooled it into serenity. "I find," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying, "that the quality of a marriage is measured not by public displays, but by private respect. Those who must advertise their happiness often have little of substance to show." Adrian moved before conscious thought, crossing the space between them, his hand still gloved coming to rest at the small of Eleanor's back, a touch so light it barely existed, yet claiming her nonetheless. "My wife speaks wisely," he said, his voice cold as winter frost, his eyes fixed on Lady Ashworth. "Perhaps if more marriages were founded on respect rather than performance, there would be fewer miserable souls seeking entertainment in others' private affairs." The silence that followed was profound. Adrian escorted Eleanor to the carriage shortly after, both of them trembling with unspent emotion. In the darkness of the carriage, as they rounded a corner, his hand slipped against hers, no gloves now. He'd removed them in his agitation, skin against skin, for the first time since their wedding. Both pulled away as though burned, but Eleanor felt the ghost of his warmth long after, and Adrian stared at his hand in the darkness, wondering how such brief contact could feel like salvation and damnation at once. Autumn deepened into winter's approach, and Blackwood Manor transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The gardens Eleanor had reclaimed bloomed one final time before frost, the roses she had nurtured offering their last crimson offerings to the dying season. But more than the grounds had changed, the house itself felt different, as though the walls had learned to breathe again, as though light found corners that had been dark for years. Adrian sought her company now, no longer hiding behind the pretense of estate business. He would appear in the library where she read, settling into the chair opposite hers with his own book, content to share the silence that had become companionship rather than exile. He accompanied her on walks through the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice losing its careful formality as they discussed everything and nothing, philosophy and poetry, memories of childhood, dreams they had abandoned. One afternoon, as they walked beneath bare branches laced with early frost, Eleanor laughed at something he said. A dry observation about the vicar's endless sermons, and the sound stopped Adrian mid-stride. He stared at her, at the way joy transformed her face, and felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble like ancient walls against a rising tide. His hand moved without permission, reaching for hers, wanting desperately to twine their fingers together, to close the distance he had so rigorously maintained. But fear, old, familiar, suffocating, stopped him inches away. His hand fell back to his side, and he looked away, his jaw tight with the effort of denial. Eleanor saw it all. She saw his hand rise, saw the longing in his eyes, saw the moment fear conquered desire. The pain of it settled in her chest like ice forming over still water. She understood then, with terrible clarity, that she had fallen in love with her husband, had given her heart to a man who would never allow himself to claim it. She loved his sharp mind and his hidden kindness, his wounded soul and his stubborn honor. She loved the way he listened when she spoke, the way his eyes softened when he thought she wasn't watching, the way he had slowly, carefully let her past his walls, but only so far, never far enough. That night, alone in her quarters, Eleanor wept for the first time since coming to Blackwood Manor, mourning a marriage that was everything except what she needed it to be. December arrived with ominous skies, clouds massing on the horizon like armies preparing for siege. The air held that peculiar heaviness that precedes great storms, a pressure that made breathing difficult, that turned the manor's atmosphere from merely melancholy to something approaching dread. Lady Catherine Thorne, Adrian's younger sister, arrived unannounced in a flurry of expensive furs and barely concealed concern, her sharp eyes assessing Eleanor with the precision of a jeweler examining a questionable stone. She cornered Eleanor in the morning room, her manner civil but cold. "I feel I must speak plainly," Catherine said, her teacup balanced perfectly on her knee. "My brother has suffered greatly, and I will not see him wounded again. Whatever expectations you harbor about this marriage, I advise you to abandon them. Adrian will never love again. He made that choice when he buried his wife, and it is a choice you must respect." Eleanor's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "I have no expectations beyond those we agreed upon, Lady Catherine. It was a lie, and they both knew it." That evening, Eleanor passed by Adrian's study and heard voices, his and his sister's, raised in argument. She knew she should not listen, knew eavesdropping was beneath her dignity, but her feet would not move. "She looks at you with stars in her eyes, Adrian," Catherine was saying. "It's cruel to let her hope. There is no hope to give." Adrian's voice was rough, anguished. "The arrangement remains as it was." "I cannot, will not," he stopped, and Eleanor heard something break in the silence, perhaps a glass. "I will not love her, Catherine. I cannot survive losing someone again. The arrangement stands. It must stand." Eleanor fled to her chambers, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She had known, of course she had known, but hearing the words spoken aloud, his absolute rejection, his determination never to love her, carved something vital from her chest. Meanwhile, Adrian sat alone in his study, his head in his hands, lying to himself as surely as he had lied to his sister. Because the terrible truth was that he already loved Eleanor, had loved her perhaps since she first filled his house with roses, and the knowledge was destroying him. Outside, the wind began to howl, and the servants whispered of the great storm coming, the worst in living memory. The storm broke near midnight with the fury of divine judgment, wind screaming around the manor's stone walls, rain lashing the windows like accusations. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, watching Adrian prepare to venture into the maelstrom, his heavy coat already dark with moisture, his face set with grim determination. The Dawson cottage roof was weak, he said, checking his lamp, though the wind would surely extinguish it within moments. And the Mitchells' children, if the stream floods, they'll be trapped. I must ensure everyone is safe. Eleanor's fingers twisted in her shawl. Then let me come with you. 2 sets of eyes, 2 pairs of hands. No. His voice was sharp, final. I will not risk you. But you'll risk yourself. Her voice rose despite her efforts at control. Adrian, please, this is madness. Send the grooms. Send... He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes stole her breath, fear and longing, and something that looked achingly like love, all barely restrained beneath his iron control. I must go, Eleanor. It is my duty, my responsibility. I cannot ask others to brave what I will not face myself. His gloved hand rose, hovering near her cheek, then fell. I promise I will return. The door opened to chaos, and he was gone, swallowed by the howling darkness. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, then rushed to the window, watching his lamp bobbing through the storm like a willow wisp, growing smaller, dimmer, until it vanished entirely. She waited in the entrance hall, pacing, her heart keeping time with the thunder. Mrs. Phillips brought tea that grew cold, untouched. The clock struck 1, then 2. The storm's fury only increased, battering the manor with relentless violence. At 3:30, Adrian's horse returned riderless, wild-eyed with terror, its saddle torn. Eleanor's world tilted. The grooms rushed to calm the animal, their faces grave, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty. Adrian was out there somewhere, alone, possibly hurt, possibly she would not complete the thought. Instead, she ran for her cloak, for boots, for a lamp, while the servants protested and the storm raged and her heart screamed a single, desperate prayer. Let him live, let him live, let him live. The storm fought her every step, wind tearing at her cloak, rain blinding her, mud sucking at her boots, as though the earth itself conspired to keep her from him. Eleanor pushed forward along the path toward the tenant cottages, her lamp a feeble shield against the overwhelming darkness, calling Adrian's name until her throat was raw. The stream had become a river, swollen with rain and rage, its banks overflowing, and it was there near the old stone bridge where the water churned white with fury that she found him. A massive oak had fallen, its ancient roots torn from the softened earth, and beneath its crushing weight lay Adrian, motionless, his face pale as death in her lamp's trembling light. No, Eleanor breathed, then screamed it. No! She fell to her knees beside him, her hands finding his throat, searching desperately for a pulse. They're faint, too faint, but present. He was alive. His leg was pinned beneath a thick branch, his coat torn, blood seeping dark against darker fabric. His skin was ice cold, his lips tinged blue hypothermia, taking him even as she found him. The tree was impossibly heavy, but Eleanor was beyond reason now, beyond the limits of what she thought herself capable of. She braced her feet in the mud, wrapped her arms around the branch, and pulled with strength born of pure desperation and love. Yes, love. She acknowledged it fully now, let it fuel her muscles as she screamed against the storm and heaved with everything she possessed. The branch shifted, inch by impossible inch. Her hands tore, splinters driving deep into her palms, but she felt nothing except the imperative that he must live, he must survive. She would not lose him to the darkness and the cold. With a final, agonized effort, the branch lifted enough for her to drag Adrian free, his body dead weight in her arms. She collapsed beside him, gasping, weeping, her hands moving over him to assess the damage his leg bent at a wrong angle, a gash across his temple, his breathing shallow and labored. The manor was too far, the storm too violent. She had to find shelter, had to get him warm, or they would both die here by this furious stream. She saw it then, the old groundskeeper's cottage, barely visible through the rain, abandoned but standing. Shelter, survival, hope. Eleanor half-carried, half-dragged Adrian through the last desperate yards to the cottage, her strength fueled by terror and determination, her body screaming protests she refused to acknowledge. The door yielded to her shoulder, and they tumbled inside, out of the storm's teeth, into darkness that felt almost peaceful by comparison. She had no time for relief. Adrian's breathing was dangerously shallow, his skin like marble beneath her trembling fingers. Eleanor's hands moved with purpose, born of necessity. She had nursed her father through his final illness, had learned the practical ministrations that propriety usually denied gentlewomen. She stripped away Adrian's sodden coat and waistcoat, her ruined hands fumbling with buttons and fabric, past caring about impropriety when death waited in the wings. The cottage held remnants of its former life, a few sticks of furniture, moth-eaten blankets in a trunk, most blessedly a small store of wood beside a serviceable hearth. Eleanor coaxed fire from flint with bleeding fingers, each spark a small prayer, until flames caught and grew, pushing back the cold and darkness. She wrapped Adrian in every blanket she could find, chafed his hands and feet, cleaned the wound on his temple with strips torn from her petticoat. His leg she could not set properly, but she bound it as best she could, whispering apologies when he groaned in unconscious pain. Through the long night, as the storm battered the cottage and the fire burned low and was rebuilt, Adrian drifted in the grey country between consciousness and oblivion. He spoke in fragments, his voice broken and desperate. "Catherine," he called first, and Eleanor's heart clenched. "Catherine, forgive me. I should have protected you, should have kept you safe." Then later, as fever took him, "Eleanor, Eleanor, don't leave, please. I cannot lose." His hand clutched at air, searching, and Eleanor caught it, held it between both of hers despite the agony in her torn palms. "I'm here," she whispered fiercely. "I'm here, Adrian. I won't leave you." She understood then, with the clarity that comes in darkness before dawn, that his fear was not of loving but of the inevitable loss that followed love, that he had built his walls not from cruelty but from a grief so profound he believed it would destroy him to feel it again. He loved her, she knew it now with absolute certainty, and that love terrified him more than any storm. Dawn broke grey and exhausted, the storm having spent its fury somewhere in the darkest hours, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely silent. Adrian opened his eyes to pain his leg, a symphony of agony, his head throbbing, but these sensations were distant compared to the sight that met him. Eleanor sat slumped against the wall beside the dying fire, her face smudged with ash and mud, her hair fallen from its pins in wild tangles, her hands wrapped in crude bandages dark with blood. She had fallen asleep sitting up, as though unwilling to leave her post even for the comfort of lying down, and in the pale morning light she looked both devastatingly beautiful and utterly ruined. Memory crashed over him in waves, the falling tree, the crushing weight, darkness taking him. And then Eleanor's voice cutting through oblivion, her hands dragging him free, her warmth keeping death at bay through the endless night. She had risked everything, for him, the man who had married her and refused to touch her, who had given her a beautiful prison and called it protection, who had been too much a coward to admit what his heart had known for months. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. She startled awake, immediately moving toward him despite her obvious exhaustion. "Adrian, thank God. How do you feel? Your leg is broken, I think, and you had fever through the night." "You saved my life." The words felt inadequate, too small for what she had done. His eyes found her bandaged hands. "You hurt yourself. You could have died." "So could you," she replied simply, tears suddenly streaming down her face. "And I could not bear it. I could not." He reached for her then. Propriety be damned, fear be damned, all his carefully constructed walls crumbling to dust. His hand cupped her face, feeling the warmth of her skin, the reality of her alive and present and his. "I have been a fool," he said, his own tears falling freely now. "I told myself I was protecting us both, that distance was safety, that I could not survive loving and losing again. But I failed, Eleanor. I fell in love with you despite every vow I made, and the fear of losing you has been slowly destroying me." His voice broke. "I love you. God help me. I love you so desperately that the thought of a world without you is unbearable. And I have wasted so much time." They returned to Blackwood Manor as dawn fully broke. Adrian carried on a makeshift litter by grooms who had searched through the night. Eleanor walking beside him with her ruined hands and her heart full of fragile hope. The physician came, set Adrian's leg properly, dosed him with laudanum for the pain, and prescribed rest. Eleanor hovered in the doorway of his chambers until Mrs. Phillips gently suggested she should rest as well, should tend her own wounds, and she retreated to her quarters feeling unmoored, uncertain whether the words spoken in that cottage had been truth or merely Fever's lies. 3 days passed, then 4. Adrian remained sequestered in his chambers, recovering, and Eleanor told herself his absence was reasonable, necessary for healing. But when he finally emerged, pale and leaning on a cane, he did not seek her out. He nodded politely when they passed in corridors, thanked her formally for her quick thinking during the storm, and retreated to his study as though nothing had changed between them, as though he had not held her face and confessed love with tears streaming down his cheeks. Eleanor felt herself fracturing. Had she imagined the desperate tenderness in his voice? Had the confession been nothing more than delirium, words that meant everything to her but nothing to him? She watched him withdraw behind his walls again, watched him rebuild the distance between them brick by careful brick, and the pain of it was worse than his initial coldness had ever been, because now she knew what they could have, and he was choosing to deny it. The household staff whispered, their concerned glances following Eleanor through rooms that felt emptier than they ever had before. Mrs. Phillips brought her tea she could not drink. The gardener mentioned that the roses would need winter protection, and Eleanor could not find it in herself to care. By the 7th day, as December snow began to fall and Adrian still avoided her eyes, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity. She could not live this half-life, suspended between hope and despair, loving a man who would not or could not love her in return. Something had to break, or she would. Eleanor found him in the library at twilight, the room shadowed and cold despite the fire burning in the grate. He stood at the window with his back to her, one hand braced against the frame, the other gripping his cane, and she thought how perfectly the image captured him, a man forever looking out at a world he refused to fully inhabit. "Adrian," she said, and her voice did not waver though her hands trembled. "We must speak." He did not turn. "Eleanor, if this is about your hands, the physician assured me they will heal without. It is not about my hands." She moved into the room, positioning herself where he could not ignore her without obvious rudeness. "It is about us, about what you said in that cottage and what you have done since." Now he looked at her, his face a mask of careful neutrality that made her want to scream. "I was delirious, fevered. Whatever I said, do not," she interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Do not insult me by pretending you do not remember. You told me you loved me, Adrian. You held my face and wept, and confessed that the fear of losing me was destroying you. And now you hide from me as though I am the danger, as though I am something to be survived rather than—" Her voice broke, but she forced herself onward. "I love you. I have loved you for months, and I can no longer live in this limbo, this half-existence where we are married but separate, where we orbit each other like planets that can never touch. I am asking you, begging you for truth. Do you love me, or was it Fever speaking? Because if you cannot love me, I must leave. I want either a real marriage or an annulment, but I will not live another day as your beautiful ghost." Adrian's face contorted with anguish, all his careful control shattering. "You do not understand what you ask. Then make me understand. She died." The words tore from him like something vital being ripped away. "Catherine died because I loved her, because I wanted her, because I put my needs above her safety. The physicians warned us her constitution was delicate. Childbirth would be dangerous, but I was selfish. I wanted an heir, I wanted. And she died screaming. Eleanor. She died in agony, begging me to save her, and I could do nothing. Nothing." He was weeping now, openly, his body shaking. "I vowed I would never put another woman at risk, that I would never let my love become someone's death sentence. And then you—" He looked at her with such raw pain it stole her breath. "You are everything. And if I give in to this, if I love you as I want to, completely, without walls, and then I lose you." His voice failed entirely. Eleanor crossed the space between them, her ruined hands reaching for his face, forcing him to see her, to truly see her. "Do you think I do not know about death, Adrian? I watched my father destroy himself slowly, day by day, drinking away his pain and our future. I held his hand as he died, knowing I could not save him. I understand loss. I understand that loving someone does not guarantee their safety or their survival. Her voice was fierce now, blazing with conviction. But what you call protection is its own kind of death. You have been dying by inches in this mausoleum you have made of your life, and you would have me die beside you, not from childbirth or illness, but from loneliness and from the slow starvation of a heart that is never allowed to fully give or receive love. Adrian tried to turn away, but she held him fast. Catherine's death was not your fault. It was tragedy, cruel and random and unbearable, but it was not your punishment for loving her. And denying yourself love for the rest of your life will not bring her back or honor her memory. It only ensures that her death claimed 2 lives instead of 1. You do not understand the risk, he whispered, desperately. If anything happened to you because of me, then I would die having been loved. The words rang through the library like a bell. I would die having lived, Adrian, truly lived, not merely existed in beautiful rooms with a man too afraid to touch me. Yes, there are risks, there are always risks. I could fall from a horse, catch influenza, have my heart simply stop in the night. We are all walking toward death from the moment we are born. The only choice we have is whether we truly live first. She gentled her voice, her thumbs brushing away his tears. I am not Catherine. I am Eleanor, and I am choosing this, choosing you, choosing us, choosing love with full knowledge of every risk. But I cannot choose for both of us. You must decide. Will you live in fear of loss, or will you live in love despite it? Adrian stared at her. This woman who had walked into a storm to save him, who stood before him now offering not just her love, but her very life, trusting him with both. And in that moment, he understood his walls had not protected either of them. They had only ensured a different kind of suffering, a slower death of isolation and denial. He had to choose, fear or love, death or life, prison or freedom. Adrian's hands came up to cover hers where they still held his face, and he turned to press his lips against her scarred palm, kissing the evidence of her sacrifice, her courage, her love. Forgive me, he whispered against her skin. Forgive me for the coldness, for the months I wasted, for every moment I made you feel unwanted when you were the only thing I wanted. Forgive me for being too much a coward to see that you were offering me salvation, not damnation. Eleanor's answer was to pull him down to her, to close the final distance between them, and their first kiss was salt tears and desperate tenderness, months of longing released in a single breathless moment. Adrian kissed her as though she were air and he had been drowning, as though she were dawn after endless night, and Eleanor felt herself falling, soaring, shattering into something new and whole. I choose you, Adrian breathed against her lips. I choose love. I choose life. I choose us. Every risk, every fear, all of it. I choose you, Eleanor, today and every day after. That night, Adrian moved his belongings from the west wing to Eleanor's chambers, no longer separate, no longer divided. The servants smiled as they carried his books and clothes, as lamplight spilled from rooms that had been dark, as laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence. The manor itself seemed to transform, as though the building had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Eleanor played piano while Adrian read beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They took meals together, lingered over wine and conversation that stretched into the small hours. They walked through winter gardens with fingers intertwined, and Adrian no longer wore his gloves, no longer maintained the careful distance that had defined their early months. They spoke of everything of Catherine without shame or guilt, of Eleanor's father without bitterness, of dreams they had thought lost and futures they might build together. They learned each other slowly, completely, with the reverence of 2 people who understood how precious and fragile love could be, and chose it anyway. Blackwood Manor, which had been a mausoleum, became a home, and 2 people who had been ghosts began, finally, truly, to live. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a transformation so complete that visitors to Blackwood Manor remarked they scarcely recognized the place. The gardens bloomed under Eleanor's devoted care, the tenant families thrived with roofs that no longer leaked, and fields planted with good seed, and through it all, Adrian and Eleanor moved as 2 halves of a completed whole, their happiness evident in every shared glance, every casual touch, every laugh that rang through rooms once silent. When Eleanor discovered she was with child, she felt Adrian's terror like a physical thing, saw it in the sudden whiteness of his face, the trembling of his hands as they rested on her still flat belly. But this time, he did not retreat. Instead, he faced his fear directly, hiring the finest physicians in England, consulting with every expert, preparing obsessively for every possible complication. Yet he also trusted in Eleanor's strength, in the doctor's skill, in the love that bound them, in life itself. "I am afraid," he confessed to her one night as they lay together in the darkness, his hands spanning her swelling belly. "Every moment, I am terrified, but I would not trade this fear for the emptiness we had before. Whatever comes, we face it together." Eleanor's labor came with the first roses of summer, long and difficult but not dangerous. And when their daughter finally arrived, red-faced and furious and perfectly, gloriously alive, Adrian wept as he had wept in that storm-battered cottage. But these were different tears entirely. He held his daughter with shaking hands, this tiny creature who represented everything he had feared and everything he had learned to hope for, and felt the last chains of his old grief finally, completely, break. "Her name?" Eleanor asked softly from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "Hope," Adrian whispered, pressing his lips to the baby's forehead. "We shall call her Hope, because that is what you gave me." The estate prospered as never before, not merely in crops and profits, but in the kind of wealth that cannot be measured in joy and purpose, in community and care, in the knowledge that fear had been faced and love had won. 5 years had painted Blackwood Manor in colors Adrian had once believed lost to him forever. The gardens bloomed in riots of summer abundance, and through them ran 3 small figures in white dresses, Hope at 5, Grace at 3, and baby Faith toddling after her sisters with determined steps, her laughter like music carried on the warm breeze. Adrian sat beside Eleanor on the garden bench she had commissioned, his arm around her shoulders, watching their daughters chase butterflies through the roses she had brought back to life. His hair held threads of silver now, and Eleanor's face bore the soft lines of a woman who had smiled often and deeply, and they were more beautiful to each other than they had been on that cold wedding day that felt like another lifetime entirely. "Do you remember?" Eleanor said softly, her head resting against his shoulder. "When you told me you would never touch me." Adrian's hand tightened on hers, their fingers interlaced as naturally as breathing. "I remember being a fool who mistook fear for wisdom, isolation for safety. I remember the woman who saved my life twice, once from a storm and once from myself." They watched Hope lift Faith into her arms to see a butterfly more closely. They watched Grace spin in circles until she collapsed dizzy and giggling into the grass. And Adrian felt gratitude so profound it bordered on prayer. Dear listener, perhaps you too have known fear, the kind that builds walls around your heart and calls it protection, that mistakes loneliness for safety, that believes loving again means risking everything you cannot bear to lose. But here is the truth that Adrian and Eleanor learned in that storm-battered cottage and every day after. We are all walking toward loss from the moment we first love, and the only choice we have is whether we truly live first. Love requires the courage to be vulnerable, to tear down walls brick by brick, to risk the pain of loss for the privilege of connection. It is not the absence of fear, but the decision to love despite it that transforms us, that redeems us, that makes us finally, fully, alive. May you find the courage to open your heart when it has learned to close. May you discover that the walls you built for protection have become your prison. May you know love that is worth every risk, every fear, every moment of uncertainty. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that it is never too late to choose love over fear, life over mere existence, hope over despair. This has been a story from Sweetly Told Tales. If these words have touched you, let them remind you that your own story is still being written, and the next chapter begins with a single brave choice. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, love always, always finds a way.